So now I'm going to try to describe how I think Michelangelo arrived at the design of these buildings. So we're going to try to go into Michelangelo's brain. We don't have a lot of evidence for what was happening apart from the buildings themselves. But the buildings themselves are so rigorous and clear, they give us a lot of clues about how Michelangelo may have arrived at their design. Now, I believe that Michelangelo was trying very deliberately here to reflect the Roman Forum, to really see it, his piazza of the Campidoglio, as literally a mirror about the hinge of the Palazzo Senatorio with the Roman Forum. It inflects the same way towards the Senatorio as the Forum reflects to the Tabularium. Now, the Forum was primarily defined on its flanks by two basilicas, the Basilica Aemilia and the Basilica Julia. Some of the Basilica Aemilia had survived into Michelangelo's day and was drawn by a number of architects around his time, and he had access to those drawings. They knew it also a bit from descriptions, and they knew the other basilica, the Basilica Julia, as well from descriptions, even though it had been absorbed into other buildings and very little of its architecture remained. But he had a sense of how the space was organized. He knew what was in those buildings, and he knew what a basilica was. So now we have to recover that idea of what a basilica is. And for Michelangelo, his source probably was the ancient Roman writer Vitruvius, who wrote a treatise on architecture, the only surviving treatise from antiquity. And Vitruvius describes a basilica in its ideal or typical form, and then he also describes one that he designed, that Michelangelo could not have seen. No one had seen it because it had been destroyed long ago, but Vitruvius gives us a fairly accurate description of how he designed it and what he was trying to do when he designed it. So Michelangelo probably relied as much on that text as a source as he did on the actual remains in the Forum. The Basilica Aemilia had something called tabernae inserted into its effectively front facade or in the loggia that screened it from the Forum. Tabernae are, well, it's where we get our word tavern, but what they really were cell-like spaces, shops essentially, single room, sometimes with a balcony or loft built into them, but essentially a series of single cell-like spaces. And those were essentially grafted onto, and they had been predated, in fact, the building of the Basilica Aemilia. Now, what was a basilica? A basilica was essentially a large courthouse building, but really a big meeting hall. It was a large hall-like space surrounded by arcades on the inside on 2 stories. And that idea that it was a meeting hall with a single space in the middle, but also arcades around it, meant that 2 different kinds of functions could go on. The large gatherings in the center, but also private conversations, especially upstairs, where Vitruvius describes a high parapet wall that would screen the upstairs people discussing their business in private, and so they couldn't be seen from the great hall space down below. Now, in Michelangelo's day, in the 16th century, there were other architects thinking about basilicas. In the 1540s, the architect Andrea Palladio designs the basilica of the town of Vicenza. Palladio, who wrote a treatise, unlike Michelangelo, who never wrote a treatise, Palladio wrote a treatise in which he describes the ancient Roman basilica, again, a little bit based on Vitruvius, because he says, we don't really know what basilicas look like. We don't have any left, but we have Vitruvius, and he tells us. So we have Palladio and we have Vitruvius telling us about basilicas. And then we have Palladio also saying that our modern basilicas, by which he means basically town halls, large meeting halls for representative governments. He said our basilicas, by which again he means our town halls, are different from the ancient Roman ones because our basilicas have the meeting space upstairs and they have loggias or shops down below for doing business and for citizens to gather out of the rain and the sun. Vitruvius also says that basilicas provide these kinds of porticos or loggias for gathering away from the sunshine in the shade. And Rome can be quite hot in the summertime. So here's Michelangelo, thinking about the Roman Forum, flanked by these basilicas, for which he has a little bit of evidence, some physical, some descriptive from the ancient city. And he's got the text of Vitruvius. And what probably intrigued him about the text of Vitruvius wasn't just the notion of what a typical basilica was like. And Vitruvius essentially describes a kind of generic typical basilica, a little bit different from both the Aemilia and Julia, but similar enough to give us an idea of the type. But the fact that Vitruvius describes his own, of which he's very proud, and it has a particular innovation for which Michelangelo would not have seen any example surviving in the ancient world, in the ancient city of Rome. It's something that we now call a colossal order, a tall column that runs through 2 stories of the building. And so Vitruvius describes in his basilica at Fano, or Fanum, the ancient city of Fanum, a basilica in which the central space, instead of being surrounded by two tiers of arcades with columns, is defined by tall columns that run up through 2 stories, 50 feet tall, with their own entablature and the roof sitting on top of that. That idea of a colossal order, an order that rises through 2 stories, became incredibly important to Michelangelo and was maybe his greatest contribution to the history of classical architecture. It becomes a motif, a form that propagates its way all over Rome and all over Europe for centuries on. So let's try to think about what Michelangelo might have done in arriving at these designs for the buildings. He's not building an ancient Roman basilica because there's not going to be meeting space on the ground floor. It's going to be 1 story up. He's going to have to incorporate shops, not really shops so much, but meeting spaces like tabernae that are centers for the guilds of Renaissance Rome. The butchers' guilds and the shopkeepers' guilds and various guilds that organize the trades and businesses of the center of Rome. And those have to be incorporated on the ground floor where they always were in the Palazzo dei Conservatori. The meeting hall upstairs are more or less going to be preserved as they were. But he's going to wrap all of this in a new architectural form. And I believe what Michelangelo essentially did was take the basilica at Fano, which has its tall columns running through 2 stories, take the roof off and essentially turn it inside out. Make the outside space of the basilica the inside space of these new basilicas here on the Piazza del Campidoglio. And what had been the basilica's internal gathering space is Michelangelo's piazza or forum. It's as if the basilica has been turned inside out and the piazza itself is a kind of basilica-like space, surrounded by regular arcaded facades that are like the kind of facades that Vitruvius describes for the inside of the basilica. And so these loggiaed ground floors and these colossal columns come from the basilica at Fano. But at the basilica at Fano, they faced inward. Here they face outward. They give a new facade to the building, but they make of our space here of the piazza a kind of outdoor room. Not just any room, but a basilica room, a gathering room, a political room, a place where deliberation can also happen. Michelangelo was quite loyal to the idea of republican or representative government. And he was interested in sustaining the idea that this was a representative space for the people of Rome. He was now a citizen of Rome. He was one of those people of Rome. And he's interested in supporting the idea that there's political life here, that this is not just a showpiece for the papacy. This is where real political thinking goes on and where the life of the city is really orchestrated and determined. So that's how I think Michelangelo arrived at the design of this piazza, taking Vitruvius' basilica at Fano, turning it inside out, and using that element that Vitruvius describes, but for which Michelangelo would not have seen any examples in antiquity, and using that as the new front for these buildings, with its colossal order rising through 2 stories, stitching these 2 stories together. Because now, instead of the basilica meeting hall being on the ground as it was in the basilica, it's upstairs, like the meeting halls in medieval palaces and medieval basilicas of Italy. That meeting hall that takes place upstairs is, if you like, semi-private. You have to be invited. This one, anyone can enter into. The piazza is the public meeting hall, like the forum. Anybody can gather here, and deliberative government can take place here in the space of the city, open to the citizens, transparent, if you like. But now we're going to talk about the specific forms that Michelangelo used, and some very deliberate choices he made, because there's another kind of invention he brought to this language of architecture. Not just the colossal order, which, interestingly, he also uses for the redesign of St. Peter's. Michelangelo is responsible around this same time for being the architect of St. Peter's. He inherits the early project of Bramante, which had gone moribund, and he returns it to its logic as a centrally planned space. But he wraps it in a colossal order, just like this colossal order. And he's essentially saying there are 2 equivalent poles of authority here in Rome. The poles of authority of the political realm here at the Campidoglio and the sacred realm at St. Peter's. And they get something of the same kind of architecture. But this one's a more nimble kind of architecture that has to respond to big spaces, small spaces, different scales, and different ways in which the space and the building inside is being used. So now let's talk about those specific forms, the colossal order, the way it finds itself in the Palazzo Senatorio, and specifically how he deals with the lower story and the tabernae.